Welcome to the Blackout Witness. When the power goes out, everything changes. Streets turn silent, houses become shadows, and for a few minutes, the world feels much bigger and much less safe. Tonight's stories come from people who saw something during those dark hours. Some were alone, some had nowhere to run, and some still do not know what was watching them when the lights finally came back on. Before we begin, leave a comment and tell me where you are listening from tonight. And if you enjoy true scary stories with a slow, unsettling feel, subscribe to the Blackout Witness. Turn off the lights, if you dare. Let's begin. When some friends and I played with a Ouija board at my old house, something happened that I still cannot explain. I have always been a skeptic. I am usually the kind of person who tries to find the obvious answer first. If a door moves, I think it is a draft. If a light flickers, I think it is bad wiring. If someone says a place is haunted, I assume there is a logical explanation that nobody has found yet. And when it came to Ouija boards, I was even worse. I was the person who would make jokes. I was the person who would provoke whatever we were supposedly talking to. I would tell everyone there was no way it was real. I would say someone was clearly moving the planchette without admitting it. I would point out that people can push things subconsciously without realizing it. I would be the one laughing when everyone else got quiet. Basically, I was the exact person who should probably not have been playing with one at all. At the time, I was living in a house where strange things had already happened from time to time. Nothing that made me fully believe it was haunted, but enough small things that the house had a weird reputation with the people who spent time there. It was an older place, and it had the usual sounds old houses make. The floors creaked, pipes knocked, doors sometimes stuck or moved differently depending on the weather. But there were other incidents too, things that were harder to dismiss in the moment. I remember coming home from school one day and finding doors open that should not have been open. Not just one bedroom door swinging slightly because a window was open somewhere. I mean almost every door in the house. Closet doors, cabinet doors, cupboard doors, even the double doors that had latches. They were all flung wide open. I had been the last person to leave that morning and the first person to come home. There should not have been anyone inside. Nobody had come by. Nobody had a reason to go through every room and open things. At first I tried to explain it away. Maybe somebody had stopped by unexpectedly. Maybe the latches were loose. Maybe the house had shifted somehow. Maybe a draft had caught the doors. But that did not explain everything being open at once. Not the cabinets, not the cupboards, not the double doors with latches. Still, I did not immediately decide it meant ghosts. I just told myself it was weird. That house had weird moments. Everyone has lived somewhere that gives them a strange feeling now and then. But the Ouija board night was different. That was the one night where I stopped being able to laugh as easily. It was me, my girlfriend at the time, my best friend, and his girlfriend. The four of us were hanging out at my house one evening with nothing major planned. It was just one of those nights where you sit around talking, making jokes, eating whatever is in the kitchen, and trying to decide what to do because nobody wants to go home yet. At some point, someone brought out the Ouija board. I do not even remember who suggested it. It may have been sitting around the house already. Maybe somebody had brought it over. Maybe we found it while looking for a game. But once it came out, everyone was interested enough to sit down and play. The board was set up in the room, and we gathered around it. There was my girlfriend beside me, my best friend across from us, and his girlfriend nearby. The lights were not completely off, but the room was dimmer than usual. We were not trying to make it dramatic at first. We were mostly just messing around. I remember looking at everyone and laughing. I said something along the lines of, "There is no way this is real." Nobody argued too hard. We were all skeptical in different ways. Some people were more open to the paranormal than others, but nobody was sitting there completely convinced we were about to contact something from another world. At least, not when we started. We placed our fingers lightly on the planchette. The first few questions were the normal kind. Is anyone here? Can you hear us? Are you good? Are you bad? That kind of thing. And almost immediately, the planchette began moving. It moved quickly. That was the first thing that bothered me. Usually, when people tell stories about Ouija boards, they say the planchette slowly slides toward a letter or word. Maybe it moves a little at a time. Maybe everyone feels someone in the group pushing it. Maybe it stops and starts. But this did not feel like that. The planchette would move across the board fast, almost before we had finished asking the question. Someone would start speaking, and before the sentence was even over, it would already be sliding toward letters. It did not scrape. It did not hesitate. It seemed to move smoothly, as if it knew where it was going. At first, I still assumed somebody was moving it. I looked at everyone's hands. I watched my best friend, his girlfriend, my girlfriend, and then my own hand. Nobody looked like they were forcing it. Nobody was leaning in. Nobody was grinning like they were about to reveal a joke. Still, I kept telling myself it had to be one of us. Maybe someone was doing it without realizing it. Maybe the board was on a smoother surface than I thought. Maybe the movement felt faster because we were all focused on it. Maybe I was making it more dramatic in my head. That was what I believed. Then I started provoking it. That is just how I was back then. I wanted something undeniable to happen. I did not want vague answers or little movements that could be blamed on the people around the board. I wanted proof. I wanted something that would force everyone in the room to stop pretending it was just a game. So I started talking directly to whatever we were supposedly communicating with. I remember demanding, "Physically prove to me that you're here." I probably said it more than once. I was challenging it, not screaming, not doing some horror movie ritual, but mocking it enough that I was basically telling it to do something real. Physically prove to me that you're here. For a few seconds, the planchette stopped. That was strange because it had been moving quickly before that. Everyone looked down at the board. The room got quieter. Then the planchette started moving again. It went to W, then A, then T, then C. I remember watching it spell the word and thinking, okay, watch what? Then it moved to H. Watch. The moment it hit the H, my best friend's phone started calling his girlfriend's phone. Nobody was touching either phone. That is the detail I cannot get past. Both phones were sitting away from the board. Nobody had picked them up. Nobody had slipped away to make a call. Nobody had their hands near them. We were all sitting there with our fingers on the planchette, staring at the board. Then suddenly, my friend's phone lit up and showed that it was calling his girlfriend. Her phone began ringing. For 1 second, nobody moved. We all looked at the phones. Then we looked at each other. The timing was too perfect. The board had just spelled watch. Then the phones started calling each other. My best friend reached for his phone. His girlfriend reached for hers. They both looked confused. Neither one had initiated the call. Neither one had touched a button. Neither one had even been looking at their phone when it happened. We answered the call. At first, I expected to hear someone breathing. Maybe static. Maybe a prank voice. Maybe one of us had accidentally connected the phones somehow. But there was nothing. Dead silence. My friend's phone showed that the call had been accepted. Her phone showed the same thing. The call was active. But neither phone had sound. No voice. No background noise, no feedback, nothing. Then both phones froze. Not just lagged, not just acted weird for a second. They completely froze. My friend tried to end the call from his phone. Nothing happened. His girlfriend tried to end the call from hers. Nothing happened. They pressed buttons, tapped the screen, tried everything they could think of, but neither phone responded. Back then, phones still had removable batteries. You could take the back cover off, pull the battery out, wait a second, put it back in, and restart the entire thing. That was the only thing we could do. So they pulled the batteries out of both phones. The screens went black. The call ended because the phones were physically shut down. For a moment, everyone just sat there. The room felt different after that. Before, we had been laughing and trying to make something happen. Now nobody was laughing. The board was still sitting between us. The planchette was still under our fingers. The two phones were dead on the floor or table beside us, and every person in the room was thinking the same thing. What the hell was that? I remember trying to find an explanation. Maybe my friend had set up some weird shortcut on his phone. Maybe the phones had connected through Bluetooth. Maybe one of them had accidentally called the other earlier and the call had only gone through at that moment. Maybe there was some kind of technical problem. But even those explanations did not feel right. The call had started exactly when the planchette finished spelling watch. That timing was too strange to ignore. Still, I was skeptical, or at least I was trying to be. I remember saying that we should ask the board if it had been responsible. Part of me wanted to prove it was not. I wanted it to give some vague answer or no answer at all so we could laugh and move on. I wanted to believe the phones had glitched and we were simply making a bigger deal out of it because we were already playing with a Ouija board. So once the phones were restarted, we asked again, "Was that you calling her phone from Ryan's?" The planchette hesitated. It did not move right away. For the first time all night, it seemed to pause like it was considering something. Then it began sliding across the board again. W-A-T-C-H. It spelled watch a second time. And just like before, the phones started calling each other again. My friend's phone began calling his girlfriend's. Her phone rang. Neither one of them was touching anything. The same call appeared. The same dead silence happened when they answered. The same freezing happened to both phones. I remember the feeling in my chest when it happened the second time. The first time could have been a bizarre coincidence, a technical glitch, a random malfunction, something strange but explainable. But twice, right after the board spelled the exact same word, that was the moment where the whole room broke. Nobody wanted to keep playing. Nobody wanted to ask another question. Nobody wanted to see what would happen if we challenged it again. My friend and his girlfriend pulled the batteries from their phones again. We turned them back on slowly. Then we checked the call logs. There was nothing. No record of the calls. No missed call. No outgoing call. No accepted call. No active call. Nothing in either phone's history that showed the phones had ever contacted each other. That was when somebody said, "Okay, fuck this." And that was when we stopped. We did not say goodbye properly. We did not ask another question. We did not sit there trying to provoke it again. We just moved the board away and decided we were done. No one in the room wanted to play with it after that. I remember the silence afterward. Everyone was talking quietly, but nobody knew what to say. We kept repeating the same questions. Did you touch your phone? No. Did you have some app or shortcut? No. Was your phone already calling? No. Why was there no call history? Nobody had an answer. Even I did not have one. And I was the person who had spent the whole night demanding proof. The person who had insisted none of it could be real. The person who had provoked whatever we were talking to. After that, I did not play with a Ouija board again. I still do not know whether I believe we contacted something. I am still a skeptic. That is the strange part. I have not become the person who says every weird thing is supernatural. I still look for explanations. I still think people can influence a planchette without knowing it. I still think electronics can malfunction in bizarre ways. I still think fear and expectation can make people connect events that are not connected. But that night is difficult to fit into a simple explanation. The planchette moved before questions were finished. It spelled watch. My friend's phone called his girlfriend's phone without either of them touching it. The call had no sound. Both phones froze. The batteries had to be physically removed to stop the call. The phones had no call history afterward. Then we asked the board whether it had done it. It spelled watch again, and the same thing happened a second time. I have replayed it in my head so many times. Maybe one of us was unconsciously moving the planchette, but that would not explain the phones. Maybe the phones had some kind of bizarre technical problem, but that would not explain the timing. Maybe someone in the room set it up as a prank, but that would mean they somehow controlled both phones, made them freeze, and erased the call history without anyone noticing. That seems impossible. Maybe it was all coincidence. Two unrelated events happening close together, twice. But the odds of it happening in exactly that way are hard for me to accept. Then there was the house itself. The place already had a history of strange things happening. I had lived there long enough to know that the doors and cupboards did not always feel normal. I still remember coming home from school and finding almost everything open. Every door, every cabinet, every cupboard, the double doors with latches. It looked like someone had walked through the entire house, opening everything they could find, but there had been nobody there. I had been the last person to leave in the morning and the first person to come home later. I had checked. I had looked through the rooms. Nothing seemed stolen. Nothing looked disturbed besides the doors being wide open. I told myself it was probably something mechanical. Maybe the pressure in the house changed. Maybe a window had been left open. Maybe the latches had failed. Maybe someone had come in and left without me knowing. But I never found a satisfying explanation. And after the Ouija board incident, those earlier moments felt different. The house did not suddenly become a haunted house in my mind. I did not start seeing ghosts in every corner. I did not have strange things happen everywhere I went. In fact, that house was the only place where I experienced that kind of repeated weirdness. That is another reason the story stayed with me. I have lived in other places since then. I have slept in old houses. I have been alone in dark rooms. I have heard normal creaks, felt drafts, and seen shadows move across walls. Nothing else ever felt like that house. Nothing else ever made me question whether I was dealing with something I could not explain. I still do not know what was in that room with us that night. Maybe nothing. Maybe we created the whole experience through fear, suggestion, and coincidence. Maybe the board was moving because of the ideomotor effect, where people move something unconsciously without realizing it. Maybe the phones were malfunctioning for reasons we did not understand. Maybe the timing was just terrible. That is the explanation I try to hold on to. But some part of me still remembers the exact second the planchette landed on H. Watch. Then the phones started ringing, and every person in the room stopped believing it was only a game. It was a Friday night, just like any other, and we were all hanging around, talking, laughing, and killing time the way we usually did when nobody had anything better planned. One of our friends was renting a place near the center of town for the semester. It was an old house that had been divided into several separate units, 3 stories tall with different people living on each floor. From the street, It looked like the kind of house that had been there forever. The paint was faded in places, the porch leaned just slightly, and the windows had that old look where you could not tell whether they were dirty, fogged, or simply too old to ever look clear again. It was not abandoned or obviously creepy. People lived there. Cars were parked outside. Lights were on in some of the other units, but it still had that feeling old houses sometimes have, especially after dark. The floors creaked under your feet. The doors never closed quietly. The pipes knocked at random times. And the rooms felt colder than they should have, even when the heat was running. Our friend had mentioned before that people in the house believed there was a ghost there. At first, we thought he was exaggerating. Every old rental house seems to have some story attached to it. Someone hears footsteps upstairs. Someone sees a shadow near the bathroom. Someone has a weird dream after sleeping in a room that always feels cold. But he seemed serious. He said that people who had lived in the house before him had all talked about a resident ghost, not something that appeared every night, not something that attacked anyone or made the place impossible to live in, more like a presence that showed up now and then. Someone would hear a door open when nobody came in. Someone would see movement at the end of a hall. Someone would feel like they were being watched in an empty room. Apparently, the story had been passed from tenant to tenant for years. Earlier that evening, one of us had done a quick internet search about the address. We were not even looking for ghost stories. Someone had just been curious about how old the house was. But during that search, we found information suggesting that the address had once been connected to a hospital back in the early 1900s, around 1903. That detail changed the mood. Before that, the place was just an old rental house with creaky floors and strange rumors. After that, it became an old building connected to a hospital. Our friend told us that people who believed in the ghost thought it might be a former patient, someone who had died there long before the house became apartments. Nobody knew whether that was true. Nobody had names, records, or a clear story about who it could have been. It was just one of those local legends that seemed to grow each time someone repeated it. Still, once you hear that a place used to be a hospital, every small sound feels different. A creak in the floor becomes a footstep. A cold draft becomes a person passing behind you. A shadow near the door becomes someone standing there. Even if you do not fully believe it, your mind starts looking for proof. That was basically where we were that Friday night. There were several of us sitting around in the living room. The lights were low but not turned off. Someone had music playing quietly from a phone. There were cups, snack wrappers, and random things spread around the room. A few people were on the couch. Others were sitting on the floor or leaning against the walls. We were laughing about the ghost story, but not in a completely relaxed way. Everyone was joking, but everyone was also listening more carefully to the house. You could feel it. Whenever the floor creaked, people looked up. Whenever someone heard a sound from another room, conversation paused for half a second. Nobody wanted to admit they were nervous, but the old hospital story had gotten under everyone's skin. Then G started laughing. G was always the person in the group who had to push things further than everyone else. If someone told a scary story, he would be the one to dare people to go into the dark basement. If people said not to touch something, he would touch it. If someone said a place was haunted, he would be the first person to mock whatever was supposed to be there. He stood up from where he had been sitting and stretched his arms out wide like he was standing in the middle of a wrestling ring. Then he looked around the room and shouted, "Come on, ghost." Everybody laughed at first. G was grinning, clearly enjoying the attention. Then he raised his voice even more. "What, are you scared?" he called out. "Show yourself if you're real." The room went quiet. It was strange how fast it happened. 1 second, people were laughing. The next, nobody was saying anything. Even G seemed to pause for a moment after he shouted it. Maybe he was waiting for someone to laugh again. Maybe he expected someone to say he was being stupid. Maybe he just wanted to make everyone nervous. Nothing happened. No door slammed. No light flickered. No voice answered. The house stayed quiet. For a few seconds, it felt like we could all breathe again. Someone made a joke about how the ghost was too busy to come out. Another person laughed and said maybe it had gone to bed. The tension started fading. Then the Alexa on the shelf across the room lit up. The blue ring came on suddenly. It was bright enough that everyone noticed it at the same time. The room was already dim, so the blue light stood out sharply against the dark shelves and the old walls behind it. It did not flash like a normal notification. It did not play music. It did not make a sound. It just lit up. The blue ring glowed steadily. Nobody had said Alexa. Nobody had touched the device. Nobody had asked it a question. And yet there it was, lit up as if it had been activated. Everyone froze. I remember looking from the Alexa to the others in the room. Nobody moved. Nobody laughed. The silence became heavy in a way that is hard to explain unless you have been in a group of people who all noticed something strange at exactly the same moment. We were all thinking the same thing. Did it just respond? The timing was too perfect. G had just yelled for the ghost to show itself. The house had gone quiet. Then the Alexa lit up across the room. Maybe it had picked up a word that sounded like its name. Maybe the device had glitched. Maybe somebody's voice triggered it without realizing it. That was the logical explanation, and I think everyone in the room knew that. But no one said it right away, because the timing made it feel personal. For a few seconds, the blue ring stayed on. Nothing came out of the speaker. No robotic voice. No question. No notification. Just the silent blue light. Then G, because he could never leave anything alone, laughed again. It was a louder laugh this time, but there was nervousness in it. He pointed toward the Alexa and said, "You a bitch, Alexa." The words had barely left his mouth when we heard a loud cracking sound. It was not a small creak. It was not the normal sound of an old house settling. It was sharp and heavy, like something had snapped under pressure. Everyone turned toward the shelf. For a split second, the shelf seemed to hold. Then, the entire thing collapsed. Everything on it came crashing down at once. Books hit the floor. Glass shattered. Decorations and small objects bounced across the room. The Alexa dropped with everything else. The shelf itself came down in a violent, chaotic tumble, slamming into the floor so hard that it sounded like the whole room shook. The crash was loud enough to make everyone jump. It did not happen slowly. There was no warning where the shelf leaned a little, then tilted, then fell. It was standing there one moment, and the next it was on the floor with everything else scattered around it. For a second, nobody said anything. The room was full of broken glass, loose books, and debris. The blue light from the Alexa was gone. The laughter was gone too. I remember looking at G. His face had changed completely. He was no longer grinning. Nobody was. There are moments when fear takes over so quickly that your body reacts before your mind can catch up. You do not have time to decide what the reasonable thing is. You do not think through whether the shelf had loose brackets, whether it was old, whether someone had bumped it earlier, or whether the weight of the books had finally become too much. You just feel danger. And that was what happened. Nobody said, "Let's inspect it." Nobody said, "Maybe the shelf was loose." Nobody bent down to check the wall brackets. We ran. All of us. It was not graceful. People stumbled over each other. Someone nearly tripped over a bag. Someone else knocked into the edge of the couch. We rushed toward the door like the house had suddenly become unsafe. I do not even remember who got out first. I only remember the sound of people moving fast, the front door opening, and the cold air outside hitting us as we rushed onto the porch and down toward the street. We stood outside for a long time. At first, nobody said much. Everyone was breathing hard, trying to calm down. Some people were laughing nervously, because that is what people do when they are scared and do not know what else to do. Others were staring back at the house. The windows were dark and silent. From outside, the building looked completely normal. Nothing had changed. There was no figure in the window, no strange light on the third floor, no sound coming from inside, just an old house sitting there in the dark. But we all knew what had happened. G had challenged the ghost. The Alexa had lit up without saying anything. Then he insulted it. Then the shelf collapsed. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe the shelf had been loose for months and finally gave out at that exact moment. Maybe it had been overloaded with books and decorations. Maybe the wall bracket had cracked earlier in the day and the timing was simply terrible. That is probably the explanation most people would choose, and honestly, it might be the correct one. Old shelves collapse. Cheap brackets fail. Old walls do not always hold things properly. A shelf full of books can become heavy enough to pull itself out of the wall. There are plenty of ordinary reasons it could have happened, but that does not make the timing any less unsettling. The shelf did not collapse when someone leaned on it. It did not collapse while people were moving things around. It did not collapse earlier in the evening when everyone was laughing and walking through the room. It collapsed immediately after G yelled at the Alexa, right after the Alexa had lit up in response to his challenge. That is what none of us could get over. The timing. We all ended up talking about it outside. Some people said the Alexa must have been triggered by accident. Someone suggested that it may have picked up a sound from the television, music, or another conversation. Another person said the shelf was obviously old and probably unstable. Everyone was trying to make sense of it, but nobody wanted to go back inside. That said more than anything else. If we had truly believed it was only a loose shelf, someone would have gone back in right away. Someone would have picked up the Alexa, checked the wall, cleaned up the glass, and moved on. Instead, we stood outside staring at the building. Eventually, our friend who lived there had to go back in because it was his home and his stuff was on the floor. But even he did not seem eager. A couple of us went in with him after a while, mostly because leaving him alone felt wrong. The living room looked even worse once we came back inside. The shelf had completely detached from the wall. The screws or brackets had failed somehow, and everything that had been on it was scattered across the floor. There were books open face down, broken pieces of glass, small objects rolled under furniture, and dust from the wall where the shelf had been. The Alexa was on the floor too. We picked it up carefully. It still worked. There was nothing obviously wrong with it. Nobody could find evidence that someone had touched it or moved it. Nobody had been standing near it when the blue light came on. The device had just lit up, stayed quiet, and then the shelf had collapsed after G mocked it. We checked the wall. The brackets looked old. There were cracks or weak areas where the shelf had been attached. That should have made everyone feel better, but it did not. A weak shelf explained the collapse. It did not explain the timing. It did not explain why the Alexa lit up when G called out to the ghost. Maybe the two things had nothing to do with each other. Maybe the house had a loose shelf and an electronic device that randomly activated on the same night. That is possible. But in that room, after hearing the hospital story and sitting through the eerie silence, it did not feel like coincidence. It felt like something had answered. The strange thing is that the story about the house was not even supposed to be scary at first. We had all gone there to hang out. It was Friday. We were supposed to talk, laugh, maybe watch something, and eventually go home. Instead, We left with that image burned into our minds, the blue ring of the Alexa glowing in the dark room. G standing there with his arms raised, challenging something nobody could see. The sudden crack, the shelf collapsing in one violent crash, and the feeling that the whole house had been waiting for someone to push too far. I still do not know what happened that night. I cannot honestly say it was a ghost. I cannot say a former hospital patient was hiding in the walls and waiting for someone to insult an Alexa. That sounds ridiculous when I say it out loud. But I also cannot say it was nothing. Too many things happened too perfectly. The house had a reputation. The old hospital story had been mentioned before anything happened. G called out to the ghost. The Alexa lit up silently. Then he insulted it. Then the shelf came down. Maybe the shelf had always been ready to fall. Maybe it was a loose bracket. Maybe it was just bad luck. But even now, when I think about it, I remember how everyone stopped laughing at the same time, and I remember how fast we ran. A few years ago, I was driving back to my parents' house after spending the evening at a friend's party in a nearby city. It was late, cold, and quiet enough that the drive felt longer than it normally would have. I had been around people all evening, listening to music, talking, and moving through crowded rooms, so the silence of the highway felt almost peaceful at first. The roads were mostly empty. There were a few cars here and there, but for long stretches I was driving alone, with nothing but my headlights, the dark road ahead, and the occasional glow of a distant town or gas station. It was winter, the kind of winter where the cold settles into everything and makes the world feel still. Snow had fallen earlier in the season, and the land along the highway looked pale and frozen beneath the moonlight. I was sober. I want to make that clear because I know how strange this story sounds, and I have gone over every possible explanation in my head more times than I can count. I had come from a party, but I had not been drinking or taking anything. I was tired from being out late, but I was fully aware of where I was, what I was doing, and what I saw. As I drove, I passed a large lake beside the highway. It was completely frozen over. The sight of it made me slow down without even thinking about it. The moon was full that night, hanging high in the sky and bright enough to cast a long reflection across the ice. The lake looked like a huge sheet of glass, but not smooth glass. There were faint textures and ridges across it where the ice had formed, and the moonlight made them shimmer in a way that was hard to describe. It was one of the most beautiful views I had seen in years. The lake stretched out into the darkness, surrounded by woods. The trees stood like black lines against the snow and sky. There were no houses nearby that I could see. No boats, no lights from cabins, no signs of people walking around. Just the frozen lake, the moon, and the woods. For a moment, I felt like I had found something private and almost unreal. I had been driving for a while, and the sight was too good to ignore. So I made a U-turn and headed back toward the lake. There was a designated place to pull over, maybe 40 feet or so from the edge of the road and not far from the frozen shoreline. I parked my car there. The moment I stepped outside, the cold hit me hard. It was one of those deep winter temperatures that seems to go through every layer of clothing. The air was sharp and dry, and every breath felt cold in my chest. But it was also beautiful. The silence was different from the silence of the highway. Out there by the lake, there were no engines, no music, no voices, and no traffic close enough to hear clearly. There was only the wind. Even that was faint. The trees stood still. The lake was frozen solid. I stood beside my car for a moment and just took it all in. The moonlight reflected across the ice in a wide silver path. The sky was clear enough, that I could see stars above the trees. I remember feeling small in a peaceful way. It felt like I had stumbled into a scene that nobody else was seeing. I had my phone with me, so I started taking pictures. I walked closer to the lake. Though I stayed within the area I felt was safe. The ice was thick enough that I believed it was solid, somewhere around 10 to 12 inches thick. It had been freezing for a while, and I knew enough about the weather and the lake to feel reasonably confident that I was not stepping onto something dangerous. Still, I did not go far. I wandered around near the edge, moving slowly through the snow and along the frozen shoreline. I took pictures of the moon, pictures of the lake, and pictures of the trees. I moved around to find different angles, trying to capture the reflection on the ice. The moon was southeast of my car, and I spent most of my time facing that direction. Everything felt peaceful. It was cold enough that I knew I would not stay long. I did not plan on spending an hour out there. I only wanted a few minutes to enjoy the view, take some photos, and be alone in a place that felt completely separate from the rest of the world. For a while, I did exactly that. I walked around near the lake in a kind of quiet trance. I was not thinking about much. I was just enjoying the moment. The cold had turned my hands stiff, and my breath was visible every time I exhaled. My phone battery was probably draining faster than usual from the temperature, so eventually I lowered it and decided it was time to leave. I turned to head back toward my car. That was when I saw movement near the woods. It happened fast. So fast that at first I was not sure I had actually seen anything. I caught it in the corner of my eye, a sudden jagged movement near the edge of the tree line. It looked like something had dashed out of sight, not walked, not slowly shifted. It moved quickly, like a sudden burst of motion, into the darkness. I stopped immediately. My whole body went still. I stared in the direction where I thought I had seen it. The woods were dark, but my eyes had already adjusted to the night. I had been outside long enough that I could make out the outlines of the trees, the uneven ground, the snow near the edge of the lake, and the deeper black spaces between the trunks. I kept staring. At first I told myself it was probably an animal. There was plenty of wildlife around. Deer, foxes, coyotes, raccoons, maybe even something larger depending on the area. Seeing movement in the woods at night was not unusual. Animals lived out there. They moved silently. They could disappear into the trees faster than you would expect. The strangest part was that I had not heard anything. No twig snapping, no crunching snow, no brush moving, no leaves breaking. But I tried not to give that too much meaning. The ground was frozen. The woods were quiet. An animal could move through the snow or brush without making much noise, especially if it was already far enough away. I stood there for what felt like a long time, scanning the area. Nothing moved again. The tree line looked normal. The dark gaps between the trunks stayed dark. The snow remained untouched as far as I could see. Eventually, I told myself I was overthinking it. I had been standing alone beside a frozen lake in the middle of the night. The moonlight, the cold, the empty highway, and the woods could make anything feel strange. I had probably seen a deer or some other animal rush away when it noticed me. That was the logical explanation. So I started walking back toward my car. The farther I got from the lake, the more I tried to push the feeling aside. I kept telling myself that I was fine. I was only a few steps from my car. I would get inside, turn on the heat, and continue driving home. Still, I could not stop looking toward the woods. I did not feel exactly watched, but I felt aware of the darkness in a way I had not felt before. The car was parked with the driver's side facing the open area near the woods. I reached it, opened the driver's door, and began to sit down. I was halfway into the seat. One hand was on the door, the other was reaching toward the ignition. My body was already turning inward, ready to get out of the cold. Then I saw it. An arm. A human arm. It was close enough that I saw it clearly, though only for a second. It came from the direction of the woods, from just beyond where my headlights and the moonlight gave any real detail. It was unnaturally thin, not simply skinny in the way a thin person's arm might be. It looked frail, exposed, and almost wrong in proportion. The skin looked bare. There was no sleeve, no glove, no jacket, no visible clothing at all. It reached out from the darkness for only a moment, then snapped back. That is the best way I can describe it. It did not slowly pull away. It did not move like someone casually stepping behind a tree. It snapped backward, frantic and sudden, as though whatever was attached to it had realized it had been seen. The speed of the movement was what shocked me most. 1 second, there was an arm in my vision. The next second, it was gone. I froze. My brain stopped working properly for a moment. I remember staring at the darkness where the arm had disappeared. I remember trying to decide whether I had really seen it. I remember feeling my heart pound so hard that it became difficult to hear anything else. The air suddenly felt colder. The woods looked different. The same dark trees that had been beautiful a few minutes earlier now felt like they were hiding something. I did not get out of the car. I did not walk closer. I did not call out. I did not try to prove anything. I fumbled with my keys so badly that I almost dropped them. My hands were shaking. I could not get the key into the ignition at first. I kept glancing toward the woods while trying to start the car, terrified that I would see something else move. For a few seconds, the car would not start because I was too panicked to turn the key properly. Then the engine came on. The sound felt louder than anything else in the world. I threw the car into reverse. I barely looked behind me. I backed out of the spot fast enough that I probably should not have, but I did not care. I just wanted to get back onto the highway. I wanted to get away from that lake, that tree line, and whatever had been close enough for me to see its bare arm. I pulled onto the road and drove. At first, I kept checking my mirrors. I expected to see something behind me. I expected headlights, movement, another vehicle, a person walking along the road, anything, but there was nothing. The highway was empty. The frozen lake disappeared behind me. The trees became a dark blur at the side of the road as I drove faster and farther away. I was still shaking. The drive home took around an hour and 45 minutes, and I spent the entire time in silence. I did not turn on music. I did not call anyone. I did not pull over. I just drove. The quiet inside the car was unbearable, but I did not want anything distracting me. I needed to focus on the road. I needed to make sure I was not imagining more things. I needed to prove to myself that I could get home safely. The whole way back, I kept replaying the moment, the movement near the woods, the sudden dash into darkness, the arm, the way it snapped back. I kept trying to turn it into something normal. Maybe it was a branch. Maybe I saw a deer leg or some other animal in a strange position. Maybe it was a piece of pale wood or a fallen limb catching moonlight. Maybe I had been tired from the drive. Maybe the cold had affected my vision. Maybe the dark and the bright moonlight had created some kind of illusion. I tried every explanation I could think of, but none of them felt right. A branch does not pull back. A deer leg does not look like a bare human arm. A piece of wood does not vanish with sudden frantic movement. And even if I had somehow mistaken an animal for an arm, why had I seen that movement near the woods earlier? Why had something dashed away without making a sound? Why did the whole scene feel like something was hiding just beyond the edge of where I could see? By the time I got home, I was still in shock. I went inside and told my parents what had happened. I expected them to be concerned, or at least curious. I expected them to ask questions. Maybe I hoped they would tell me I had seen something normal, something that had a clear explanation. Instead, they mostly scoffed. They thought I was being dramatic. They thought I had gotten myself scared by standing alone near the woods in the middle of the night. Maybe they assumed I had seen a deer, a branch, or a shadow and let my imagination take over. I understand why they reacted that way. The story sounds unbelievable. I know how it sounds. A frozen lake, moonlight, empty woods, a strange movement, then a naked, skeletal-looking arm pulling back into the darkness. It sounds like something from a horror movie. It sounds too strange to be true, and I would not blame anyone for doubting it. But I was there. I was sober. I was awake. I had been standing in that cold air, taking pictures of the lake, enjoying the silence. Then I saw what I saw. The arm was exposed. There was no clothing covering it. No jacket, no sleeve, no glove. Nothing that made it look like an ordinary person standing outside in sub-freezing temperatures. That is what makes it so hard to explain. Nobody should have been out there. The lake was far from any nearby town or settlement. It was not a place people casually walked around in the middle of the night. It was brutally cold. The woods were remote. There were no houses close enough that someone could have simply wandered out from a backyard or campsite. And even if someone had been out there, why would they be hiding in the trees? Why would they move so silently? Why would they pull their arm back like they had been caught watching me? I do not know. It has been 4 years, going on 5, and I still remember it like it happened an hour ago. That is what bothers me most. I have had weird dreams. I have had moments where I thought I saw something in the dark and then realized it was nothing. I have been scared by animals, shadows, and sounds before. Those memories fade. This one never did. I can still picture the lake. I can still see the moon reflected on the ice. I can still remember how peaceful I felt before anything happened. Then I can still feel the shock of seeing movement near the woods, and I can still see that arm snapping back into the darkness. Every time I tell the story, people react differently. Some people listen politely, but seem unmoved. Some people assume I saw an animal. Some people think I was tired or scared myself into seeing something. Some people simply do not know what to say. I understand all of that, because I do not have proof. I did not take a picture. I did not record a video. I did not see a face or a full body. I only saw one arm for a split second, but that split second changed me. I do not stay in the woods at night anymore. I do not drive alone through remote country roads the way I used to. I used to enjoy being out in quiet places, taking late-night drives, hunting from the road, stopping to look at scenery, and being alone with nature. Now I am more careful. I tell someone where I am going. I avoid being alone in remote places after dark. I do not stop near woods unless I absolutely have to. I keep my doors locked. I pay attention to the tree line. I know that might sound extreme to some people, but it is hard to explain how deeply one moment can affect you when you cannot make sense of it. There is an unsettled feeling that has stayed with me ever since. Sometimes I call it a premonition, though I do not know if that is the right word. It is more like a feeling that whatever I saw did not belong there. It did not feel human. It did not feel like wildlife. It did not feel like something from the normal world I understood. And that is what scares me. Not the idea that something was hiding in the woods, but the idea that I may have seen something that had no place being there at all. I have tried to reason my way through it. I have tried to make a list of every realistic possibility. A person, an animal, a branch, a reflection, a trick of moonlight, exhaustion, cold weather, fear, a momentary misinterpretation. I have done all of those mental gymnastics, but every time I come back to the same thing. The arm moved. It pulled back, and I know what I saw. Maybe I will never find closure. Maybe there is a completely normal explanation that I simply cannot see because I only experienced a few seconds of something strange. Maybe a person was out there for some reason I will never know. Maybe I saw wildlife in a way my brain could not immediately understand. Maybe the cold and darkness changed the shapes around me. I cannot prove otherwise. But I also cannot forget how real it felt. The lake had looked beautiful when I first stopped there. It was one of the most peaceful moments I had experienced in a long time. The moonlight on the ice made the whole place look almost sacred. It felt like I had stepped outside the normal world for a few minutes. Then the woods reminded me how quickly peace can turn into fear. To this day, I still think about that lake. I think about the frozen surface, the bright moon, the silence, and the trees around the shoreline. And whenever I imagine going back, I remember the arm. I remember the bare skin. I remember the thinness of it. I remember the sudden snap backward into the darkness. And I know I will probably never stop wondering what was standing in those woods that night. One of my friends grew up on a reservation, and when he was younger, he heard a lot of stories about things people in his community warned each other not to go looking for. He was Native American, and he always spoke about it carefully. He never told the stories like they were campfire entertainment. He did not laugh while telling them, and he did not act like he wanted attention. If someone brought up skinwalkers or asked him whether he believed in them, he usually became quieter than normal. He would say that where he grew up, people were taught not to chase those stories, not to seek them out, not to call for them, not to go wandering into places because you wanted proof. According to him, religious leaders and older people in the community warned that there were things better left alone. He said the basic idea was simple. They would not bother you if you did not go looking for them or trying to bother them. That was the rule. Leave things alone. Do not challenge them. Do not treat them like something to hunt. Do not make jokes if you did not understand what you were joking about. At the time, though, he and his friends were young, and young people often hear a warning and immediately want to find out whether it is true. He told me that one evening, he and a few friends decided they were going to go looking anyway. They had a pickup truck, enough gas, no real plan, and the kind of confidence that comes from being young and surrounded by friends. They were not going out with equipment. They were not prepared for anything serious. They were not carrying cameras, radios, or anything that could prove what they saw. They were just driving around at dusk, looking for something they had been told not to look for. He said that was probably their first mistake. The sun was going down when they left. The sky was still holding on to the last bit of light, but the land had already started to darken. The road they took was far from the brighter parts of town. It was the kind of road where the pavement turned into rough ground in places, where headlights mattered more than streetlights, because there were almost no streetlights at all. The truck moved through long open stretches of land, then past low trees and patches of brush. There were places where the road ran straight for a long distance, and other places where it curved between clusters of trees. The air was getting colder as the evening went on. By the time the sky had turned dark blue, the only real light came from the truck's headlights and the fading color still visible on the horizon. At first, everyone was excited. They were talking loudly, daring each other to get out of the truck, making jokes about what they would do if they actually saw something. One person probably said they would run. Another said they would fight it. Someone else said it would be better to stay in the truck and not be stupid. My friend said he was not completely comfortable with what they were doing. He had heard the warnings growing up. He had heard older people say that curiosity could bring trouble. But he was with his friends, and he did not want to be the one who ruined the night or acted afraid. So he stayed quiet. They kept driving. The truck rolled down the dark road while the headlights cut through the gathering night. Every now and then, something would move in the distance. A rabbit might cross the road. A bird could fly low from a tree. The brush along the edge of the road would shake in the wind. Nothing seemed out of place, at least, not at first. Then something flashed across the road in front of them. It happened so fast that nobody understood what they had seen right away. One moment, the road was empty. The next, a shape moved through the headlights. It was too fast to get a clear look at. It crossed in front of the truck and disappeared behind a group of trees on the other side of the road. The driver hit the brakes. Everyone in the truck went quiet. At first, they assumed it was an animal. Maybe a deer, maybe a coyote, maybe a large dog that had wandered too close to the road. But my friend said the shape had moved strangely. He could not explain why at first. It was only a flash in the headlights, but it did not look like anything he could identify. The truck stopped. The engine kept running. The headlights shone toward the trees where the thing had disappeared. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. Then someone said they should get out and look. That was the second mistake. My friend said he did not want to, but everyone was already moving. Doors opened. The warm, enclosed feeling of the truck vanished, replaced by the cold evening air. The sound of the engine seemed louder outside, and the headlights threw long shadows across the dirt and low brush. The group stood near the front of the pickup. The trees were only a short distance away, but in the darkness they looked farther than they were. The branches crossed over each other, creating black shapes that the headlights could not fully reach. Beyond the first line of trees, there was only darkness. They called out a few times. Nothing answered. Someone threw a small rock into the brush, trying to make whatever it was move. Nothing. For a moment, they started laughing again. Maybe it had been a deer after all. Maybe it had crossed the road and disappeared into the trees. Maybe they had gotten themselves worked up over nothing. Then someone noticed the eyes. They were low to the ground at first. 2 points of light reflecting back from the truck's headlights. They were deep in the trees, just far enough that the shape around them was difficult to see. But the eyes were there. Still, watching, everyone stopped talking. My friend said he could feel the mood change immediately. The jokes stopped. The confidence disappeared. Nobody wanted to step farther away from the truck. The eyes did not blink. They did not move closer. They simply reflected the headlights from the darkness between the trees. My friend stared at them, trying to understand what animal he was looking at. Then his eyes began to adjust. Slowly, he could see more of the shape around the eyes. It looked like a dog. That was the first thing he thought. A large dog, maybe a stray, maybe a coyote. But the longer he looked, the less it made sense. It was too big to be a normal dog, too tall, too narrow, too thin. Its body looked stretched and wrong, like it had the general outline of a large canine, but not the proportions of one. He described it as massive, almost the size of something much larger than a coyote, but at the same time it looked starved. Not weak, not sick, just unnaturally thin. Its ribs seemed visible in the shadows. Its legs looked too long. Its head was held low at first, but the body behind it looked far too large for the shape of its face. My friend said it was like seeing a coyote that had been stretched taller and bigger without becoming heavier. He could not compare it to a wolf exactly. He could not compare it to a dog exactly. And he said it did not look like a bear either. It looked like something that had copied the rough shape of an animal, but had gotten the details wrong. One of the people with him whispered something. My friend did not remember the exact words, but he remembered the tone. Fear. Real fear. The kind that does not need to be explained. The figure stood between the trees, almost hidden, with only the headlights catching enough of it for them to see its outline. Then it moved. At first, it shifted its weight. The group froze. The animal-like shape rose slightly. My friend thought maybe it was just stepping over something or standing on uneven ground. Then it stood up, not onto a rock, not climbing a tree, not rearing for a second the way a bear might. It stood upright on its hind legs. My friend said that was the moment he knew whatever he was looking at did not move like an ordinary animal. The body straightened. The long, thin shape rose higher. For 1 second it was fully upright in the dark, framed by the headlights and the trees. He said it looked wrong standing that way. Too tall, too narrow, too fast. The group did not have time to react. Before anyone could speak, before anyone could move toward the truck, the thing took off. It ran away on its hind legs, not stumbling, not lurching, not moving like an animal trying to balance. It moved fast, faster than anyone expected. My friend described it as superhumanly fast, a sudden blur of motion between the trees. 1 second it was standing there, and the next it was gone deeper into the darkness. It disappeared so quickly that nobody saw where it went. There was no clear sound of branches breaking, no long trail of movement, no animal crashing through the brush. It was just there, then gone. The silence afterward was worse than the sight of it. My friend said everyone stood still for a moment, staring into the trees where it had vanished. Nobody laughed. Nobody made another joke. Nobody said it was definitely a coyote or a dog. The truck's headlights continued to shine into the darkness, but there was nothing there anymore. The eyes were gone. The outline was gone. The trees looked ordinary again. But nothing felt ordinary. Then someone said they needed to leave. No one argued. They got back into the pickup as fast as they could. Doors slammed. The driver started moving immediately. Nobody wanted to stay long enough to see if the thing came back. My friend said the drive away was completely different from the drive out. Earlier, they had been loud. They had been joking and trying to act brave. Now they were quiet. Every time the headlights caught something at the side of the road, someone looked. Every shadow between the trees felt like it might move. Every animal sound outside made them tense. Nobody wanted to say the word skinwalker out loud. Nobody wanted to admit exactly what they thought they had seen. But they all knew they had seen something. They all saw the eyes. They all saw the large dog-like shape in the trees. And they all saw it stand up. My friend told me he thought about the warnings afterward. He remembered the older people who said not to go looking for things you did not understand. He remembered being told that some stories were not meant to be tested like a dare. He remembered the idea that if you did not bother certain things, they would not bother you. And he realized that he and his friends had done exactly what they were told not to do. They had gone out looking. They had stopped the truck. They had gotten out. They had called into the woods. They had thrown something into the brush. They had treated the whole thing like a joke. And then they found something. Or something found them. He did not claim he knew exactly what it was. He did not say he had proof. He did not say that everyone should believe him. In fact, he seemed uncomfortable giving the story a name at all. He only described what he saw. A shape crossing in front of the truck, eyes reflecting in the headlights, a massive, skinny, canine-looking figure. Then that thing standing upright and running away on 2 legs faster than anything should have been able to move. I asked him once whether he thought it had been following them. He said he did not know. But he said they never went looking again. That was enough for him. He did not need another sighting. He did not need proof. He did not need to go back to the same road and see whether it happened again. Whatever they saw that night had changed the way he thought about the stories he heard growing up. Before that, he had treated them like something people told kids to keep them from wandering too far into the dark. After that, he treated them like warnings, the kind of warnings you do not understand until you ignore one. I do not know what they saw. It could have been an animal seen at the wrong angle in bad light. Headlights can make things look larger than they are. Dusk can distort shapes. Fear can make a coyote look huge, and shadows can make a normal animal seem like it is standing in a way it is not. There are reasonable explanations, but I also understand why the experience stayed with him, because no matter how much you try to explain a sighting afterward, there is a difference between hearing stories and being there when something moves across your headlights. There is a difference between reading about strange things in the woods and seeing eyes looking back at you from the dark. And there is a difference between seeing an animal run away and seeing something that looks like an animal stand upright before it vanishes into the trees. My friend did not tell the story for attention. He told it because it happened, or at least because he believed it happened exactly that way. And after hearing him describe it, I understood why he never wanted to go looking for anything again. Because sometimes the worst part is not seeing something strange. Sometimes the worst part is realizing that it was already there before you started looking. Before the next witness speaks, take a second to subscribe to the Blackout Witness. News stories are shared here for the quiet hours, when the house is dark, the phone is face down, and every small sound feels louder than it should. A like and a comment help the channel reach more people who enjoy real stories with no easy answers. Now, let's go back to the night everything went dark. This one is a little goofy when I explain it now, but it scared me more than almost anything else when I was growing up. Even after all these years, I still think about it. It happened when I was camping with my entire extended family at Allegheny State Park. I was still a kid at the time, old enough to stay up late with the adults and older cousins, but young enough that a dark forest could feel like the biggest and most dangerous place in the world. Camping with my family was always loud during the day. There were too many people for anything to stay quiet for long. Aunts and uncles were cooking, cousins were running around, somebody was always opening a cooler, somebody else was looking for firewood, and there were usually several different conversations happening at the same time. The campsite had that familiar smell of smoke, hot food, bug spray, wet grass, and old tents. During the day, it felt safe. The trees were tall, but you could see the sky through them. You could hear other campers nearby. There were kids riding bikes, people walking dogs, and cars coming in and out of the campground. At night, though, it felt completely different. Once the campfires started burning lower and people began going into their tents, the forest seemed to get larger. The trees became black walls. The spaces between them turned into deep shadows. Every sound felt closer than it should have been. A twig snapping somewhere in the distance could sound like it was only a few feet away. Leaves moving in the wind sounded like something stepping through the brush. And once the normal campground noise faded, you started noticing how dark the woods really were. That night, it was probably around 11 or midnight. Most of the younger kids had gone to sleep, but some of us cousins were still awake. The adults were sitting around the fire talking, laughing, and drinking. The fire had burned down to a low orange glow, and the air had that cold nighttime feeling where the warmth disappears as soon as you step away from the flames. Then two of my uncles came up with an idea. They wanted to take the cousins out in the SUV and drive around looking for deer and other animals. At the time, this sounded exciting. My uncles had done things like that before. One of them, my Uncle Dennis, had a huge spotlight that he used for looking into the woods from the car. It was one of those ridiculously powerful spotlights that could light up a whole section of trees from far away. When he switched it on, it was like somebody had turned on a second set of headlights. He loved using it. He would slowly sweep it over the forest, looking for the reflection of animal eyes. Deer, raccoons, rabbits, foxes, maybe even something bigger if we got lucky. The rest of us would crowd against the windows, waiting for a pair of glowing eyes to appear between the trees. So, even though it was late, and I was probably already tired, I climbed into the SUV with the rest of the cousins. There were too many of us, of course. We piled in however we could. Someone was squeezed in the middle seat. Someone had a blanket around them. Someone was probably complaining that another cousin was taking up too much room. The windows were fogging slightly from everybody breathing in the cold night air, and the inside of the car smelled like jackets, campfire smoke, and whatever snacks people had dragged along. My uncles sat in the front. Uncle Dennis had the spotlight. The other uncle drove. We pulled away from the campsite, and almost immediately the mood changed. At first, we were still close enough to see other campfires between the trees. There were small orange lights flickering through the dark, tents lit from the inside, and the occasional person walking along the road with a flashlight. But as we drove farther, the campground lights disappeared. The road became narrower. The trees pressed in closer on both sides. The SUV's headlights were the only steady light ahead of us, and Uncle Dennis would occasionally roll down his window and sweep the giant spotlight into the woods. Every time the beam crossed the trees, it made everything look strange. Branches threw long shadows across the ground. Tree trunks appeared for a second and then vanished again. A patch of brush would suddenly look like a crouched animal until the light moved and revealed it was nothing. Sometimes we saw deer. Their eyes would flash bright in the beam before the rest of their bodies became visible. They would stand completely still in the trees, almost blending into the darkness, then turn and disappear soundlessly into the forest. We saw rabbits too, little pale shapes moving along the roadside. We may have seen a raccoon or two. Everyone would point and whisper whenever something appeared. Over there. Did you see that? Shine it farther back. Look, there are eyes. For a while it was fun. The adults were laughing. The cousins were talking over one another. Uncle Dennis kept scanning the woods like he was leading a safari. But the farther we drove, the less like a fun campground ride it felt. We were getting deeper into the park, away from the campsites and away from anywhere people would normally be walking around at midnight. The road curved through the trees. There were no cabins, no tents, no parked cars, no lights, just forest. At one point, the road opened up into a clearing. It was not a huge field, but compared to the tight woods we had been driving through, it felt wide and exposed. The trees pulled back on both sides, leaving a stretch of grass and uneven ground under the night sky. The headlights lit the road ahead. Uncle Dennis raised the spotlight. He started slowly scanning the clearing. The beam moved from left to right. First it lit up tall grass, then low brush, then the far side of the field. We were all pressed against the windows waiting to see deer. Maybe there would be a whole group of them standing in the grass. Maybe we would see a fox. Maybe an owl sitting low in a tree. At first I did not notice anything unusual. The spotlight passed across the field, and I saw only grass moving slightly in the night breeze. Then the light stopped. There was someone in the clearing. At first, I thought it was a person wearing a white jacket. The beam had caught a pale shape in the grass, maybe halfway across the field. It was standing upright, but not standing still. It was moving slowly. Then the spotlight held on it longer, and I realized it was a person in a rabbit suit. Not a rabbit standing like a person. Not an animal that looked strange in the headlights. A human-sized figure wearing what looked like a full rabbit costume. It had a large rabbit head, long ears, a bulky body. The whole thing looked pale or light-colored under the spotlight, though I could not tell what color it actually was in the dark. And it was hopping, slowly, not running, not walking, hopping, one heavy hop at a time through the grass. I remember the SUV going quiet. A second earlier, all of us had been talking and laughing. Then the spotlight found that figure, and nobody knew what to say. It was too strange for our brains to understand immediately. At first I thought maybe there was some kind of event nearby. Maybe a camp counselor was wearing a costume. Maybe someone was trying to entertain kids at another campsite. But there were no campsites in that part of the woods. No lights. No cars. No people. No sounds of a party or a group gathering. Nothing. Just the clearing, the trees, and a person in a rabbit suit hopping through the grass in the middle of the night. The figure did not react to us. That was the part that bothered me most. The SUV headlights were pointed toward the clearing. Uncle Dennis's spotlight was directly on it. The beam was bright enough that there was no way the person could not have noticed. But it did not turn around. It did not raise a hand. It did not cover its face. It did not stop moving. It did not act surprised or embarrassed or frightened. It simply continued hopping. Slowly, one hop. Then another. Then another. Toward the tree line. For a few seconds, nobody in the car spoke. I remember staring at it through the window, trying to make myself believe I was seeing something else. Maybe it was an inflatable decoration. Maybe it was a strange shape made by bushes and trees. Maybe the spotlight was catching an animal in a weird way. But it moved too clearly. The body bounced forward. The rabbit ears moved slightly with each hop. It was definitely someone. Or at least, it looked exactly like someone. My younger brain could not make sense of why a person would be out there. Why would anyone dress up in a rabbit suit at midnight? Why would they be alone in a clearing far from the campsites? Why would they not react when a vehicle pulled up and blasted them with a giant spotlight? And why would they keep hopping like that? I remember wanting one of my uncles to say something. I wanted one of them to laugh and explain it. Maybe there was an Easter event. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe someone had escaped from a costume party. Maybe there was a filming crew somewhere nearby. But neither uncle seemed especially alarmed. That made it even stranger. I do not remember exactly what they said. They may have laughed. They may have made some casual joke. They may have assumed it was just another weird person camping in the park. Adults can react differently to things that terrify children. They might see something bizarre and decide not to make it worse. They might think, that is weird, but it is none of our business. They might just keep driving because they do not want to get involved with a stranger in the woods. But as a kid, I remember looking at them and thinking, why are we not doing something? Why are we not asking if they are okay? Why are we not leaving immediately? Why is everyone acting like this is normal? The rabbit-suited figure kept moving. It never turned toward us. It never looked back. It did not speak. It did not wave. It did not seem to care that a car full of people was watching. It just kept hopping toward the trees. Eventually, it reached the tree line. The spotlight followed it as far as it could. For one final moment, I saw the pale rabbit shape at the edge of the forest. Then it moved between the trees and disappeared. That was it. Gone, the beam kept searching the place where it had vanished, but there was nothing else to see. Just trunks, branches, dark brush. The woods swallowed it completely. I remember feeling a wave of fear rush through me all at once. It was not only the rabbit costume, it was the fact that it had been alone, the fact that it had acted like we did not exist, the fact that there was nowhere nearby for it to have come from, the fact that it disappeared into the forest instead of toward the road, the campgrounds, or any place where another person might be. Uncle Dennis moved the spotlight around the tree line for a while. He scanned the clearing again. He scanned deeper into the woods. Nothing, no more movement, no glowing eyes, no person walking back toward the road, no car hidden nearby, no campsite, no explanation. Eventually, we drove on. The SUV moved away from the clearing, and within a few seconds, the rabbit figure was completely behind us. But I could not stop looking out the rear window. I kept expecting to see it standing in the road behind us, or hopping after the car, or appearing again between the trees. Of course, it never did. The rest of the drive was quiet compared to before. We still saw some animals. Deer crossed near the road. Uncle Dennis used the spotlight a few more times, but nobody was as excited anymore. The mood had changed. The forest no longer felt like a place where we were safely looking at wildlife from inside a vehicle. It felt like there were people out there. Strange people. People doing things that did not make sense. By the time we returned to the campsite, the fire was lower and most of the adults had gone to bed. A few people were still sitting around, wrapped in blankets, talking quietly near the last of the flames. I do not remember whether we told everyone right away. We probably did. Kids are not good at keeping something like that to themselves. I imagine we jumped out of the SUV and started explaining that we had seen a person in a rabbit suit hopping through a clearing in the middle of nowhere. The adults probably laughed. Maybe they thought we were exaggerating. Maybe they assumed it was one of the park staff, another camper, or someone doing a harmless prank. Maybe my uncles told the story in a way that made it sound funny. And honestly, I get it. A person in a rabbit suit hopping through the woods does sound ridiculous. It sounds like a joke somebody would tell around a campfire. It sounds like the beginning of a cheesy horror movie. But when you are a kid, it does not feel funny. It feels wrong. Because children understand that people are supposed to behave in certain ways. People walk. People speak. People react when headlights shine on them. People do not dress up as giant rabbits and hop alone through a dark clearing at midnight, far from campsites, without even turning their heads. That was what stayed with me. Not the costume by itself, not the idea that someone was trying to scare us. It was the calmness of the figure, the way it kept moving, the way it ignored us completely, the way it seemed like it had its own reason for being there, and we had simply interrupted it for a few seconds. Over the years, I have tried to come up with explanations. Maybe it was someone from another campsite who had been drinking and doing something stupid. Maybe they had lost a bet. Maybe there was some kind of costume party nearby. Maybe there was a local event we did not know about. Maybe a person had been filming something in the woods. Maybe it was someone trying to prank drivers who passed through that clearing. All of those are possible. There are plenty of weird people in the world, especially in places where they think nobody is watching. But every explanation has the same problem. Why was that person alone? Why was there no car nearby? Why were there no campsites in that part of the forest? Why did they not react to the spotlight? Why did they keep hopping instead of walking? And why did my uncles not seem more concerned? I have asked myself that last question a lot. Maybe they were concerned, but did not want to scare the kids. Maybe they knew the area better than I did, and assumed the person belonged to some nearby group. Maybe they thought it was harmless, and did not want to get involved. Maybe they had seen enough strange things in campgrounds over the years that a rabbit-suited stranger was not worth talking about. But as a kid, it made me feel like I was the only one who understood how unsettling it was. I felt like everyone else had seen something weird and immediately moved on, while I carried it around with me. And I did carry it around. For years. Honestly, for decades. It has probably been around 25 years now, and I still think about that person regularly. Not every day, but often enough that it is ridiculous. Sometimes I will be driving past a dark wooded area at night, and the memory will come back. Sometimes I will see a rabbit decoration around Easter, and my brain will immediately picture that pale figure hopping across the clearing. Sometimes I will see headlights sweep across a field, and for a split second I expect to see long ears in the grass. The funny thing is that I can laugh about it now. I know how absurd it sounds. I know that if someone told me the same story, I would probably smile at first. I would imagine a grown adult in a mascot costume bouncing through the forest and think it was one of the weirdest things I had ever heard. But then I would think about the details. The late hour, the empty road, the lack of campsites, the silence, the headlights, the giant spotlight, the figure not reacting, and I would understand why it stayed with them. Because some things are frightening, not because they are violent or supernatural, but because they do not make sense. A person in a rabbit suit is not automatically terrifying. A person in a rabbit suit at a children's event is normal. A person in a rabbit suit at a parade is normal. A person in a rabbit suit at a costume party is normal. But a person in a rabbit suit slowly hopping through a clearing deep in the woods at midnight, alone, while a car full of kids watches from the road, that is different. That makes your mind start asking questions it cannot answer. Was that person okay? Were they trying to scare someone? Were they high? Were they lost? Were they waiting for another person? Did they know the woods better than we did? Did they know we were there before the spotlight found them? The last question is the one I do not like thinking about. Because the figure never looked at us. But that does not mean it did not know we were there. The SUV was loud. The headlights came around the bend. The spotlight swept across the field. There is no way somebody standing in that clearing would not have noticed. Maybe that was why it kept hopping. Maybe it wanted us to think it was not human. Maybe it wanted us to leave. Maybe it was simply doing something so strange that we would never be sure what we had seen. And it worked. Because I still do not know. I have never gone back to that exact clearing to look for it. I would not even know how to find it now. Allegheny State Park is huge, and a lot can change over 25 years. Roads get repaired, trails move, trees fall, new campsites are built. Old areas become overgrown. Even if I did find it, I doubt it would give me any answers. The clearing would probably look ordinary in daylight. The trees would look smaller. The grass would look harmless. There would be no sign of a rabbit-suited figure hopping across the field. It would just be another quiet part of the park. But I know what I saw. Or at least, I know what I remember seeing. A bright spotlight moving across a dark clearing. A large rabbit shape in the grass. One slow hop, then another, and the way it disappeared into the tree line without ever turning around to look at us. It may have been nothing more than a weird person doing something weird. That is probably the most reasonable explanation. But when you are a kid in a car deep in the forest at midnight, reasonable explanations do not help much. All you know is that something is out there. Something that should not be there, and it is hopping away into the dark as if nobody saw it at all. My mother was living with us at the time. and this happened a little over a year ago. Nothing about that day felt unusual at first. It was one of those quiet afternoons where the weather is nice enough that you feel guilty staying inside. The sun was out, the grass looked bright, and there was that calm, almost sleepy feeling that comes when the neighborhood is quiet and nothing seems to be happening. I had gone out onto the front porch just to stand there for a while. I was leaning against the railing, looking down at the grass and letting the sun hit my face. I was not waiting for anyone. I was not checking the mail or doing anything important. I just wanted a few minutes of peace. Our house has a strange layout. From the front porch, if you look immediately to the left, the house drops lower before it turns sharply behind a corner toward the backyard. That lower section is partly hidden from where you stand on the porch. You cannot see around the corner unless you walk over there. Inside that lower part of the house is the downstairs basement area. At the time, that was where my mother's room was. Because of how the house is shaped, sound can travel strangely around that side. A voice from downstairs can seem like it is coming from outside. A sound from near the back of the house can echo around the corner and make it difficult to tell exactly where it started. I knew that. I had lived there long enough to understand how the house carried noise. So when I heard my mother call my name, I did not immediately think anything was wrong. The first time, I barely reacted. I heard my name come from behind the corner, from the direction of the lower part of the house. It sounded like my mother, not vaguely like her, not like a stranger calling from far away. It sounded like her voice. I remember lifting my head and looking toward the corner. I expected to see her walk around from the side of the house, maybe coming from the backyard or maybe standing near the downstairs entrance. But I could not see anything from where I was standing. The corner blocked my view. For a second, I waited. Then I heard it again. My name. The same voice. The same direction. This time I paid attention. There was something about it that did not feel right. I cannot explain exactly what it was. The voice sounded like my mother, but the way it called me felt off. It did not sound urgent. It did not sound angry. It did not sound like she needed help. It was just my name. But it was too clear, too close, and too empty. It seemed to come from the hidden area behind the sharp corner, where I could not see anyone. I stood still leaning near the railing, trying to decide what to do. Then I heard my name a third time. 3 times. The same voice. The same place. By the third call, I felt a cold feeling move through me. It was not because I thought I had heard a ghost, at least not right away. It was because my body noticed something before my mind did. The voice should have made me answer. Normally, if your mother calls your name from nearby, you respond automatically. You say, "What?" You walk toward her. You ask what she needs. But I did not answer. I did not say anything back. I just stood there, looking toward that corner. It is strange how quickly your mind starts trying to explain something when it feels wrong. I thought maybe she was in her downstairs room and had called me through an open window. Maybe she needed help with something. Maybe she was coming upstairs and was just out of sight. Maybe the sound had traveled around the side of the house. All of those explanations made sense. But there was still something in me that did not want to walk around that corner. I cannot say why. It was daylight. I was at my own house. There was no obvious danger. Nothing had moved. Nothing had touched me. Nothing had said anything except my name. Still, the idea of walking toward the voice made my stomach tighten. So instead of going around the outside of the house, I went back inside. I told myself I was just going to check downstairs. That was the reasonable thing to do. If my mother had called me from the basement area, she would be there. I would walk in, ask what she needed, and that would be the end of it. I opened the front door and stepped inside. The house felt normal. That almost made me feel silly. The familiar smell of the hallway, the normal light coming through the windows, the quiet hum of the house, it all made the porch moment feel less serious. I wondered if I had misheard something from the street. Maybe someone outside had called for someone else. Maybe a neighbor had a voice that sounded more like my mother than I realized. But I still wanted to check. I went toward the downstairs area first. I expected to find my mother in her room. She was not there. I looked around. Nothing, no television on. No footsteps. No voice. No sign that she had been downstairs recently. That was when the feeling in my chest got heavier. I stood there for a second trying to think. Maybe she had gone upstairs. Maybe she had been in the kitchen. Maybe she had called me, then moved somewhere else. Again, all reasonable. But if she had called me from downstairs, why had the room been empty? I walked farther into the house. Then I heard the shower. The sound was coming from upstairs. At first I told myself it could still be her. Maybe she had quickly gone upstairs after calling me. Maybe I had taken longer to come inside than I realized. Maybe she had called me, then gone to shower, and I was overthinking the timing. But something about it did not line up. The voice had sounded close. It had sounded like it was coming from the lower side of the house, only seconds before I came inside. I went upstairs and stood outside the bathroom door. The shower was running. Steam had probably started gathering around the room. I knocked. "Mum?" I asked. She answered from inside. I asked her if she had just called my name. There was a pause. Then she said no. She had not called me. She had been in the shower. I remember standing outside that bathroom door and feeling like the floor had shifted slightly beneath me. Not literally, but emotionally. The normal explanation I had been holding on to disappeared all at once. I asked again, just to be sure, "Did you call me from downstairs?" She said no again. She sounded confused. She had no idea what I was talking about. And I knew she had not been downstairs. The shower had been running. She was upstairs. There was no reason she would have been out behind the corner of the house calling for me. For a moment, I did not know what to say. I did not want to scare her. I did not want to sound ridiculous. So I probably just said something vague and walked away. But inside, I was panicking. I kept replaying the voice. The first time I heard my name, it had seemed normal. The second time, it had felt strange. The third time, I knew something was wrong. It had sounded like my mother. I was sure of that. That was what made it so unsettling. If it had been a random voice, maybe I could have blamed a neighbor or someone passing by. If it had been a strange sound, maybe I could have blamed the wind, pipes, an animal, or the house carrying noise in a weird way. But it was my name, and it was spoken in my mother's voice. 3 times. From a place where she was not. I still do not know what called me that day. Even writing about it makes me emotional. There are tears in my eyes when I think about it too long, because I never found an explanation that feels satisfying. Nothing else happened after that, in the same way, but I never forgot it. The fact that I did not answer still stays with me. I do not know what would have happened if I had responded. I do not know what would have happened if I had walked around the corner instead of going back inside. Maybe nothing. Maybe I would have found an empty side yard, the same grass, the same wall, the same quiet daylight, and I would have laughed at myself for being scared. Maybe there was a person out there who had left before I got around the corner. Maybe a neighbor had been nearby and the sound had carried in a strange way. Maybe somebody had called my name by coincidence. Maybe the shape of the house distorted a voice from another direction and made it sound exactly like my mother. All of those things are possible. but I cannot get past how specific it was. The voice did not sound distant. It did not sound like someone shouting from the street. It sounded like my mother was just around the corner, close enough that all I had to do was walk a few steps to reach her. And then I found her upstairs in the shower. There have been a few other times in that house when I have heard my name called. Not always as clearly. Sometimes it happened when I was alone in a room. Sometimes it sounded like someone from another part of the house. Sometimes I would stop and listen, only to realize nobody had said anything. Those moments were unsettling, but I could usually push them aside. You can mishear a television. You can mistake wind or pipes for voices. You can hear a neighbor through the wall and think it is inside your own house. The brain is good at finding familiar patterns in random sounds, especially voices. And when a person expects to hear their name, even unconsciously, they can sometimes think they hear it where there is only noise. I know that. I have told myself that many times. But the porch incident did not feel like a vague sound. It did not feel like a half-heard word. It felt direct. It felt intentional. It felt like someone wanted me to turn toward that corner. The timing made it worse, too. I was alone outside, relaxed and distracted, not thinking about anything scary. I was looking at the grass, enjoying the sun, just taking in the quiet. There was no reason for me to be on edge. Then my name came from the side of the house. Once, twice, 3 times. The more I think about it, the more I remember the feeling of the space behind the corner. I could not see it from where I stood. That mattered. If I had been able to see the lower area clearly, maybe I would have felt different. Maybe I would have seen there was nobody there and immediately understood it had to be some kind of echo or distant sound. But the corner hid everything. It created a blind spot. That small patch of space felt separate from the porch, almost like it belonged to another part of the house. The house dropped lower there. The basement area was inside that section. The wall turned sharply toward the backyard. And from the porch, all I could see was the edge of the house and the shadowed space beyond it. It was not dark outside, but the corner itself was darker than the porch because the sun did not hit it the same way. That was where the voice came from. I can still picture it. I can still hear my name. I can still remember the instinctive urge to answer, followed by the stronger instinct not to. That is something I think about often. Why did I not answer? Why did I not walk around the corner right away? Maybe it was only fear. Maybe I sensed that the voice was wrong before I consciously understood it. Maybe it was nothing more than the tone. Maybe my mother's voice had sounded almost right, but not fully right. Maybe it copied the sound of her voice without copying the normal way she would call for me. I do not know. When people talk about hearing their name called, there are usually different explanations. Some say it is stress. Some say it is fatigue. Some say it is the brain misinterpreting normal sounds. Some say voices travel in odd ways around houses, especially houses with unusual layouts, open windows, basements, vents, and hard surfaces that can echo. Others believe it is something more. A presence, a mimic, a spirit calling from somewhere it should not be. I do not know what I believe. I am not someone who wants to jump immediately to a paranormal explanation. I would rather have a normal answer. I would rather know that a neighbor was outside, that a television was playing somewhere, that the shower fan created an odd sound, or that the wind had carried a voice around the building. But no matter how hard I try to explain it, I keep returning to the same detail. My mother was upstairs in the shower. She did not call me, and the voice came from below. After that day, I became more careful when I heard my name in the house. I do not automatically answer anymore. I pause. I listen. I check where everyone is before I react. Sometimes I call back from where I am instead of walking toward the sound. Sometimes I wait to hear it again. That may sound paranoid, but the experience changed something in me. Before, a voice in the house was just a voice. Afterward, I understood how terrifying it can be when a familiar sound comes from the wrong place. The house itself has not become unlivable or constantly frightening. Nothing dramatic happened after that. There was no shadow in the basement, no face around the corner, no doors slamming, no object moving on its own. That almost makes it worse, because there is no ending. There is no final event that explains the first one. Just 3 calls of my name, a voice that sounded like my mother, an empty downstairs room, and my mother standing in the upstairs shower, confused when I asked whether she had called me. I wish I could say I found a rational explanation later. Maybe a neighbor told me they had been outside talking. Maybe I discovered that a vent near the basement carries voices from the street in a strange way. Maybe I found out someone had been walking behind the house, calling for another person with the same name. But nothing like that happened. There was no answer. It has just stayed with me. Sometimes I think about the possibility that I only heard what I expected to hear. Maybe the wind moved through the side of the house and made a sound that my brain turned into my name. Maybe the house settled, a pipe made noise, or a distant voice echoed in a pattern that sounded familiar. The human brain is powerful that way. It tries to make meaning out of uncertainty. It hears words in static. It sees faces in shadows. It recognizes voices in sounds that are not really voices. That could be what happened. But then I remember how clear it was. 3 separate times. Not a vague noise. Not a sound I had to struggle to understand. My name, spoken in my mother's voice. I do not know what would have happened if I had answered. I do not know what I would have seen if I had walked around the side of the house. Maybe I would have found nothing. Maybe that would have made it easier. Maybe it would have made it worse. All I know is that I chose to go back inside instead. I chose to look for my mother where she was supposed to be. And when I found her upstairs, the voice on the other side of the house became something I could not explain. More than a year later, I still remember it clearly. The warm sunlight, the grass in front of the porch, my hands resting on the railing, the sharp corner of the house to my left, the lower section hidden behind it, then my name, called once, then twice, then a third time, and the feeling that whatever was behind that corner knew exactly who I was. My family is from Argentina, and down there barbecues are a much bigger part of life than people outside the country might realize. They are not just something you do once in a while during summer. For a lot of families, grilling meat together is an event. It is a reason for everyone to gather, talk for hours, drink something cold, tell stories, argue about sports, and stay together until late at night. Some families even have what we call a quincho, which is basically a separate building or covered outdoor space made for barbecues and family gatherings. A quincho can be simple or elaborate. Some are little more than a roof, a table, and a grill. Others are fully built-out spaces with big brick barbecues, sinks, long tables, refrigerators, bathrooms, sound systems, and sometimes even a pool nearby. My cousins, who are from the north of Argentina, had one of those places. They lived in Salta, an area close to the mountains where summers can get very hot. The landscape around there is beautiful, but it can also feel huge and isolated. There are open stretches of land, dry hills, mountains in the distance, brush, trees, and large areas where there is no sign of another person for miles. A few kilometers away from the main house, my family had built a quincho on a small plot of land. The place had a barbecue area and a pool. It was meant for family gatherings, birthdays, weekends, and long summer afternoons. Behind the property was a huge stretch of wilderness that went toward the mountains. There was no neighborhood directly behind it, no backyards, no streets full of houses, just land, trees, brush, and the long rise of the mountains in the distance. As a child, that kind of place feels endless. Adults see it as a nice view. Kids see it as a world to explore. One day, they decided to celebrate one of my cousin's birthdays there. It was a normal family event at first. A few of his friends came over, and his two brothers were there as well. There were 3 brothers in total, all close enough in age that they grew up doing everything together. The adults stayed inside the quincho. They were talking, cooking, checking the barbecue, sitting around the tables, and enjoying the afternoon the way adults usually do at family gatherings. There may have been music playing somewhere in the background. Someone was probably cutting meat or bringing out drinks. The grill would have been smoking, and the smell of food would have drifted through the open doors and windows. The kids, of course, did not want to sit inside. They wanted to explore. The wilderness behind the quincho was too tempting. It was right there, close enough to see but large enough that it felt mysterious. There were trees and brush at the edge of the property, then open ground and uneven trails leading farther toward the mountain area. So the kids went outside. They played around the pool for a while, ran through the open space, and wandered closer to the edge of the wilderness. They were not necessarily going far enough to get completely lost, but far enough that the adults inside the quincho were no longer the center of their attention. They were children, surrounded by friends, in a place that felt like an adventure. The sun was beginning to lower by then. It was still light outside, but the evening was starting to settle in. The mountains in the distance had that darker outline they get as the sun moves behind them. The heat of the day was easing slightly, though the air was still warm. The kids were playing near the edge of the property when one of them noticed something above the mountain. At first, nobody understood what they were looking at. Something rose up into the sky. It came from the direction of the mountain or from somewhere behind it. It was not like a bird slowly taking off. It was not like a plane appearing far away on the horizon. It seemed to lift suddenly, almost vertically, as though it had launched upward from the mountain itself. The movement caught everyone's attention at once. The children stopped what they were doing and looked up. For a brief moment, whatever it was seemed to hang in the sky. Then it moved. It crossed above them at an incredible speed. According to my cousins, it shot over the area so fast that it barely looked like a normal object in motion. It was gone almost as soon as they had seen it. They described it as flying directly above or very near above them, crossing the sky with a speed that did not make sense to them. And behind it, there was light. Not necessarily a long glowing trail like something in a movie, but a bright streak or kind of luminous effect that seemed to remain for a moment after it passed. It was as though the object had moved so quickly that it left a line of brightness in the air. Then it was gone. It flew toward the horizon and disappeared. The whole thing happened in seconds, maybe even less, but it was enough to send all of them into panic. They ran back toward the quincho, yelling for the adults. The adults inside were confused at first. Kids come running in scared all the time. They see an animal, hear a noise, get spooked by something in the trees, or start exaggerating after one person reacts strongly. But these kids were not laughing. They were not making up a story for attention. They were genuinely frightened. They all began talking at once, trying to explain what they had seen. Something came out of the mountain. Something flew into the sky. Something went right over them. It was too fast. It had a light behind it. It disappeared over the horizon. The adults tried to calm them down. Maybe it was a plane. Maybe it was a satellite. Maybe it was a meteor. Maybe it was a bird catching the last sunlight. Maybe they had seen something far away and misunderstood its size or speed. But the kids insisted it had been close. They said it had not looked like a normal aircraft. They said it had come from the mountain area, risen into the sky, and then crossed above them too quickly for them to understand what they were seeing. At the time, nobody could give them an answer that felt right. The birthday continued, at least as much as it could after that. The adults probably tried to move everyone back inside. The barbecue was still going. The pool was still there. The sun was still setting. Everything around them looked normal. But for the children who saw it, the atmosphere had changed. The wilderness behind the Quincho no longer looked like a place to explore. The mountains no longer looked peaceful. The sky above the property felt too big. I did not hear the story until later, but it stayed with the family because all three brothers remembered it. That is the part that has always made it hard to dismiss. If it had been one child alone, you could say, maybe he misunderstood what he saw. Maybe he had been scared by a bird or a strange reflection. Maybe he had watched a plane from a strange angle and turned it into something bigger over time. But all three of them saw it. They were children then, but now we are all in our 30s. And they still tell the same basic story. They still insist that what they saw was real. They do not all remember every tiny detail in exactly the same way, which is normal after so many years. One remembers the object rising from the mountain. Another remembers the sudden speed. Another remembers the light trailing behind it more clearly than anything else. But the core of their story has never changed. They were outside near the Quincho. They saw something rise into the sky from the mountain area. It crossed above them incredibly fast. It left a bright trail or light effect behind it. Then it vanished toward the horizon. The older they got, the more they tried to understand it. They wondered whether it could have been military technology. They wondered whether there was some kind of aircraft or experimental equipment in the region that nobody knew about. They wondered whether it could have been something astronomical, like a meteor or space debris, even though that did not fit their memory of it rising from the mountain and flying across the sky in a controlled direction. Eventually, I spoke to my uncle about it. He is their father, and he is a scientist. He is also extremely skeptical. He is not someone who jumps to ghosts, aliens, secret creatures, or supernatural explanations. If anything, he usually prefers the most ordinary explanation possible. He believes there is probably a physical reason behind strange events, even if people do not understand it at first. That was why I was curious about his opinion. I expected him to laugh it off. I expected him to say the boys saw a meteor, a plane, or some normal object in unusual lighting. But he did not dismiss it completely. He said that the description of the light and the speed made him think it could possibly have been some kind of government or military technology. Not that he knew for sure, not that he had evidence, just that, if the story was accurate, an advanced aircraft or some sort of classified technology was one possibility he found more believable than a supernatural explanation. That made me think even more. Because the event happened around 18 years ago. If it really was some kind of technology, then what was available at that time? What kind of aircraft could move in such a way? What kind of object could appear to rise from behind a mountain, travel across the sky in seconds, and leave behind a bright line or glow? I know that people can misjudge distance and speed, especially when looking at something in the sky. A bright object far away can look close. A small object moving nearby can look huge. A meteor can appear to travel horizontally depending on the angle. A plane reflecting sunlight can suddenly become visible and then disappear. A rocket launch, space debris, a satellite flare, a fireball, or even an unusual atmospheric effect could all look strange to people who are seeing it unexpectedly. Those are reasonable possibilities. But the story has always bothered me because of how strongly they remember it. They were not looking up at the sky waiting for something unusual to happen. They were just kids playing outside behind a quincho during a birthday celebration. They were focused on exploring the wilderness, running around, and enjoying the warm evening. Then something rose from the mountain area. Something passed over them so quickly that they did not have time to process it. And when they ran back to the adults, they were all scared enough that the adults took the story seriously. That is what makes it feel different from a normal childhood memory. It was shared. All three brothers saw it. And all three still agree, even now, that whatever crossed over them that evening was not something they could identify. The place itself adds to the feeling of it. Salta is beautiful, but it can also feel ancient and vast. The mountains create strange shadows at sunset. The wilderness behind the property was wide open, with no city lights to hide the stars or make the sky feel ordinary. In a place like that, you can see things much more clearly than you can in a crowded city. The sky feels closer. The horizon feels endless. And when something moves across it unexpectedly, there is nowhere to look away. I have tried to imagine what it must have been like for them. One second, they were playing near the woods. The next, all of them were looking up at something moving in the air so fast that it barely seemed real. They must have watched it in total silence at first. Then, once it disappeared, panic would have hit all at once. Kids do not always know how to explain fear. They do not stop to analyze. They run. They tell the adults. They look for safety. And that is exactly what they did. To this day, nobody in the family has a complete answer. Some people lean toward the idea that it was some kind of aircraft or technology. Some think it may have been a meteor or other object in the atmosphere that only appeared to rise from the mountains because of perspective. Others simply think it was a strange thing seen at the wrong angle on an unusual evening. My cousins do not claim they know what it was. They only claim they saw it. And after almost 2 decades, they have not forgotten. That is the part that stays with me. People forget most ordinary evenings from childhood. They forget random birthday parties, random games outside, random conversations around a barbecue. But they do not forget something that makes them run back inside, screaming, because they think the sky has done something impossible. The quincho is still part of the family's memories. The barbecue area, the pool, the heat of the summers, the wilderness behind it, the mountains beyond the trees. But whenever that birthday gets brought up, the story always comes back. The strange object, the sudden rise, the light, the speed, the way it crossed above them and vanished into the horizon. Maybe there is a normal answer. Maybe there is a scientific explanation that would make perfect sense if someone had the exact date, time, direction, weather conditions, and location. Maybe it was something human-made. Maybe it was something astronomical. Maybe it was just a rare combination of light, distance, and perspective. But for 3 brothers who were standing there together that evening, it felt real enough to change the way they looked at the sky. And after all these years, they still swear that something flew over them near those mountains in Salta that none of them could explain. The lights may be back on, but that does not always mean the danger is gone. Every person you heard tonight had one thing in common. They saw, heard, or felt something that changed the way they looked at darkness forever? Tell me in the comments which story stayed with you the most. Subscribe to the Blackout Witness for more true stories from the moments people wish they could forget. And tonight, before you switch off the last light in your room, look twice at the window.